Martin Farkaš came back to consciousness in snow, smoke, and broken metal, with his phone still close enough to reach. The Slovak military transport had been minutes from home when it hit the mountain. Around him, the forest above Hejce, Hungary, was burning in scattered pieces, and the winter cold was closing over the crash site. He was 27 years old, a first lieutenant in the Slovak army, returning from Kosovo with soldiers who had finished their peacekeeping deployment. The lights of Košice were supposed to be ahead. Instead, the airplane had torn into Borsó Hill, and Farkaš was alive in the wreckage when every other person aboard was dying or already gone. The aircraft was a Slovak Air Force Antonov An-24, tail number 5605, a Soviet-built twin turboprop transport from 1969. It was military transport, practical and loud, built to move people and equipment. On January 19, 2006, it carried members of the Slovak K4 contingent home from Pristina, Kosovo, after a 6-month mission. For the men aboard, the hard part was supposed to be over. They had served abroad, packed their gear, boarded the plane, and were flying back toward Slovakia. There were 43 people on board, 35 passengers and 8 crew members. Most were soldiers. They had families waiting, units expecting them, and lives ready to resume. They were not flying into combat. They were going home. The destination was Košice International Airport in eastern Slovakia. In the cabin, engines droned. Men rested, talked, and waited for descent. Some were probably already thinking about who would meet them, what they would say first, and how it would feel to sleep under their own roofs again. Outside the aircraft, night covered the hills near the border. The region around Hejce and Telkebanya was wooded, steep, and cold. Snow lay on roads and trees. At about 7:40 p.m., the crew made radio contact with air traffic control in Košice. The airport was not far away. Then the aircraft dropped too low. Investigators later concluded that the crash was controlled flight into terrain. The plane was still under control, but it descended into danger while approaching Košice in darkness. It had drifted from the intended route and flown over the Tokaj Mountains instead of staying in the safer valley. The crew descended too early, toward the lights of Košice, without properly accounting for the high ground ahead. The Antonov struck trees on Borsó Hill, near Hejce, only a few miles from the Slovak border. The impact ripped through the aircraft. Metal broke open, fuel ignited. Parts of the fuselage and bodies were scattered through the forest across a wide crash area. The wreck burned in freezing conditions, deep enough in the hills that helicopters could not simply land beside it, and rescuers could not reach it easily by road. For the soldiers inside, there was no time to understand what was happening. One moment, they were on descent toward home. The next, the airplane was breaking through treetops and smashing into the mountain. Most died in the impact and fire. The men who had survived Kosovo, finished their deployment, and boarded a flight home were killed less than half an hour from Košice. Farkaš survived in a part of the aircraft that remained just intact enough to spare him. Rescuers later said he had been found in the lavatory area, which had suffered less damage than the wreck. His survival was described as luck, but luck still left him injured, disoriented, and alone in a burning forest full of dead men. He was hurt, but conscious enough to act. He reached his cell phone and called his wife, Michaela. The call was brief and almost impossible to imagine from the other side. He told her the plane had crashed in a forest. He said he was alive but weak. He asked her to alert the police and rescuers. Then the line went dead. That call mattered. Farkaš's voice turned a missing aircraft into a confirmed crash with at least one survivor. His wife had to carry the worst words a husband could speak from wreckage. The plane was down, he was alive, and he needed help. Hungarian rescue workers began moving toward Borsó Hill, but the terrain fought them. Snow covered the access roads. The site was wooded and steep. The temperature was bitterly cold. Firefighters had to reach burning wreckage while searching for anyone still alive. The wreck was not a single clean piece of aircraft. It was debris, flame, smoke, and human loss spread through the trees. The rescuers found Farkaš alive. He had suffered injuries, including minor brain swelling and lung damage, but he was breathing when they reached him. In a crash that killed 42 people, one man still had a pulse. He was taken for medical treatment in Košice, placed in a medically induced coma, and later reported stable. The news devastated the country. The dead were soldiers returning from a peacekeeping mission, not men lost in battle. Their families had expected reunions. Instead, they received notification that the plane had crashed. Slovakia lowered flags to half-staff. Sirens sounded in tribute. A state memorial service was held in Prešov. The disaster became the deadliest aviation accident in Slovak history, and the worst military loss the country had suffered since independence. For the families, the details were even harder because of the distance. The crash happened in Hungary, only a short distance from Slovakia. Some of the soldiers died so close to home that the border itself became part of the grief. They had crossed most of Europe, escaped the dangers of deployment, and died on the last stretch of the flight. Investigators examined the route, the descent, and the crew's situational awareness. The final picture was not a mystery explosion or enemy action. It was a military transport flown too low in darkness over terrain that should have remained below them. Reports described the aircraft as having gone off the planned path and descended too early while approaching Košice. Farkaš recovered physically, but surviving was not the end of the story. He had lived through a disaster that killed colleagues seated only yards away. He had heard or felt the impact that ended 42 lives. He had called his wife from the wreckage while injured and surrounded by destruction. Years later, he attended memorial events for the dead, standing as the only living witness to a night that belonged to every family who lost someone on Borsó Hill. The memorials became part of the landscape. Near Hejce, monuments and markers honored the 42 victims. Slovak and Hungarian officials, soldiers, relatives, and local residents returned year after year. Wreaths were laid, names were read, candles were lit. The crash was remembered not only as an aviation accident, but as a shared wound between neighboring countries, because Hungarians had watched rescue crews climb their mountain to recover Slovak soldiers who had nearly made it home. For Farkaš, every anniversary carried a meaning no one else could fully enter. He was not a survivor of a crash where many escaped. He was the only one. That kind of survival can feel like rescue and burden at the same time. The world called it miraculous. The families of the dead could only look at him and see the one life the mountain had not taken. The An-24 had been less than 30 miles from Košice when it hit Borsó Hill. The soldiers aboard were almost home. Their mission in Kosovo was finished. Their families were waiting. Then the aircraft descended into the dark Hungarian hills, struck the forest, and burned in the snow. 42 men died before they could step back onto Slovak soil. Martin Farkaš survived because one small section of the plane held together long enough for him to breathe, reach his phone, and tell his wife the truth. The crash took nearly everyone else. It left him with injuries, memory, and the weight of being the only voice that came out of the wreckage alive. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.